Good afternoon, everybody. You are with AJU B'Yachad Together. I'm going to give this just a couple of minutes, not even that long, for everyone to come and join us as I see our participants are entering this webinar. So we'll just give it all a second and just smile and say welcome. My name is Deb Engel-Collin. I am the Relationship Manager for the Miller Introduction to Judaism program here at American Jewish University. And this afternoon, you are joining us on the B'Yachad Together platform spearheaded by AJU. The B'Yachad platform was started by American Jewish University as an answer to the pandemic. In our case, we are offering online learning experiences for the community in all sorts of different topics because AJU is just a gem in the middle of Los Angeles and in Simi Valley at our Brandeis campus that we have. For those of you who don't know about AJU, we have an undergraduate program. We have the Ziegler School of Rabbinics. We have the Moss Center for Jewish Journeys. We have our schools for education, which I am an alumni of. And we have our business school. And today in discussion, we are going to be having David Groshoff with Marco Greenberg. Again, for those of you who are just joining us, my name is Deb Engel-Collin, and you are with B'Yachad Together, spearheaded by American Jewish University. Today, we have the privilege and the pleasure to have our own David Groshoff, who is a JD, MBA, EDM. He's our dean of our Graduate School of Nonprofit Management and a professor of business and law here at American Jewish University. And today we are privileged to have him in conversation with Marco Greenberg. Marco is the author of the Wall Street Journal best-selling list for business books in July 2020 of Primitive, Tapping the Primal Drive that powers the world's most successful people. So congratulations on that, Marco.
Thank you,
Marco is a native Angelino, like me. We actually went to the same high school and, you know, in the game of Jewish geography, have a lot of people in common. And Marco has spearheaded marketing communications and public affair campaigns for an array of Fortune 500 corporations, healthcare organizations, and notable venture and angel-backed startups. He served as a senior advisor to foreign governments, democratic movements, and NGOs. He was previously a managing director at the global PR giant Burson Marsteller, and he sees his role as a creative catalyst for breakthrough communications. We are thrilled to have him here today, and at that, I am going to let everyone know that today we are, our chat function is not going to be on, so we're going to ask you to put your questions in the Q&A, and without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to David and Marco. So thank you. I'm looking forward to this conversation very much.
Thank you, Deb, and so am I, that's for sure. And welcome, Marco, and thank you for joining us today to discuss recalibrating professional success during uncertain times with the overlay, again, being your book, Primitive. Which, I guess before I get into my thoughts and questions, if you could maybe just spend a couple of minutes and tell us what was your inspiration as to why you wanted to write this book and tell us the things that are included in this book.
Absolutely, David, and thanks to you and Deb and all your team at AJU for the opportunity. As Deb mentioned, I'm from Southern California originally, but if I fast forward to 2016, in July, I was looking at sailboats in the beautiful town of Newport, Rhode Island. And I was part of a group called the Defining Moments Society. The Schottenstein family, amongst other leaders in the Jewish community, helped organize it. And I was doing an exercise. The idea for the book actually came by writing my own obituary. That's right, you heard that correctly. Dr. Erica Brown brought me and 4 other couples together, all in our 50s, and basically had us dig down deep and think about what do we want to do with the next 30 or 40 years of our lives. And I had spent my career, the first 3 decades, as a marketing and PR executive, as Deb mentioned, promoting others. So one of the profound realizations I had in writing my obit is obviously we have a very limited time on planet Earth, and it's time for me to raise my voice. The question is, how do I do that, and how do I aggregate the collective wisdom that I've been fortunate to be exposed to? And I've worked with Fortune 500 CEOs and many members of the Forbes list and crazy artists, mad scientists. And I realized that they have something in common that goes beyond the common nomenclature of today, which is someone is a disruptor, a change agent, a maverick, a rebel, etc. Yes, these people march to their own drum. They're free spirits. But the idea of primitive is something I think more profound, and it goes back tens of thousands of years to our primitive brain. And yes, I'm reclaiming a very loaded word, but I mean it in the most pure, in the most positive sense of that which is intuitive, that which is innate, that which is instinctive. And unfortunately, whether it's kids in grade school or people in corporations, we have a lot of that beaten out of us. So this is a call to throw out that civilized rule book, ironically, some might say at a very uncertain time, and instead embrace not what we should do, not what we must do, but what we truly, deeply want to do.
Great, thank you. As I guess to then maybe give a little foil to the idea of being primitive, I'll start then with what you describe as the opposite of primitive, which is civilized. I'll use the air quotes there. And you use an acronym to talk about what is civilized, and I guess thus what is not primitive. And you use the acronym of HOMING, which would be hierarchical, occupational, measured, insulated, non-confrontational, and grounded. And so I don't know if you wanted to speak about the civilized piece of that before we then go into the various pieces
I
of
think
what.
it's actually a great place to start, David. And I'm hardly, the next Carl Jung here with introverts and extroverts, or those that talk about the right brain or the left brain, or am I an executive corporate type? Am I an entrepreneur? Am I a morning person? Am I a night person? But I do think that the prevailing conventional, tried and true approach to our professional life is to be more, quote, civilized. There is a spectrum out there, obviously. I'll talk about primitive in a moment. I'm a bit of a mutt in between, although I skew towards primitive. But whether it is MBA programs that can be terrific, whether it is the culture of certain corporations, we're often taught to be good team players, play nicely in the sandbox, drive consensus. And there's an advantage to that. And we need people like that. In the startups that I've worked with, the civilized people are the people who took these crazy primitives who relied on their primal instinct and kept them on the rails, right? Civilized people cross the T's, dot the I's. They are about process. They are about scalability. And again, they're needed. But I think society is skewed too far in the civilized direction, and we've punished those who do march to their own drummer, who do have a different way of doing things. And when we talk about diversity obviously in terms of racial designation, ethnicity, et cetera, genders, but it also applies to diversity of thought. So what I'm seeing in the workplace is we need to reclaim that which is more primal. And people who are more civilized are in fact homing, but people who are more primitive are those who are doing something else. And the acronym there is roaming. right? And I'm not just talking about our cell phones when we go into a foreign country. Roaming also stands for a way to tap into that primal energy. And I know a lot of people out there are probably saying, wow, I'm pretty civilized, right? I did the right things. I was a good little boy, good little girl. I got straight A's. I went to an Ivy League school. I rose to the top of my corporation. What's wrong? The answer is nothing's wrong with that per se. But if you look at the research and just anecdotally, a lot of people are burnt out. Over 68% of Americans at one time or another are burnt out from their job. We don't even have to go into all the complexities around COVID, protests, et cetera. This is a very unusual time. So what I'm saying in roaming is basically to tap into 7 different traits that I believe, and research bears me out on this, can help you leapfrog ahead professionally, can help you pivot and go in a different direction if that's in fact what you want to do, and is very of the moment. So I'd be happy to go into that, but I want to turn it back to you because as a PR guy, I can be long-winded as warned.
It's all good. Thanks, Marco. I think one of the things I did want to insert is as you mentioned, one of the things I liked about this book is, in addition to the anecdotes that you give about a wide diversity of people, backgrounds, experiences, which I thought was great. That was actually underpinned in a lot of ways with things that were Jewish in many ways, and I'll talk about those later. But was the inclusion of data and studies, whether they're neurological data, psychological data, data about people in the workplace. And so it's not just anecdotal evidence. It's anecdotal evidence in this book that then is buttressed by a number of studies that really make I think the discussion in the book quite robust. But to go to maybe the 30,000 foot level, if that's all right with you, Marco, I'll kind of walk through each of the items in the roaming acronym, and then we can kind of move into several of those as you might wish that might be best to talk about recalibrating professional success during uncertain times. But to run through the acronym of roaming, to be primitive, Marco, you identify, starting with relentless, oppositional, agnostic, maybe as opposed to agnostic, messianic, insecure, and I'll just preface this next one by saying that people need to read the chapter on this to understand where you're coming from, I think, which is nuts. And some people might be put off by that, but I would encourage them to read the chapter before being so put off, because it's really heartfelt and good. And then gallant. So it's relentless, oppositional, agnostic, messianic, insecure, nuts, and gallant.
Right. Yeah. And as you mentioned, some of those traits are a bit counterintuitive, especially for those of us in the professional workplace. And some of the words can be misconstrued. So maybe I can just run through very quickly so that people can be able to tap into that, because that's the idea, to make this more prescriptive. And as a client of mine, Kirk McDonald at AT&T reminded me, he said, Marco, you're writing this book for the civilized among us, those who do want to change things and go in a different direction and perhaps take some more calculated risks than they have in their career. So very quickly, relentless is not just working hard. That's a given. As we say in Hebrew, that's muvan me'elav. That's understood from the get-go. Instead, what I mean by relentless is being able to take quick right turns, left turns, U-turns. Sometimes it may stop the car altogether and quit. Yes, you can quit out there. And I detail some profiles of individuals in the workforce who have done everything from tell white lies to have play dates rather than conference calls as a way to be relentless and have that surge of energy come through them. O is oppositional. We saw that today when Barry Weiss of the New York Times, a friend, submitted her resignation to the New York Times. There is out there this tendency to believe that we should agree. We know, according to research, what happens sometimes when people agree in the corporate setting. Not only do they gain actually less respect, but that consensus building can often have very negative consequences. Look at the groupthink that existed around Enron or Swiss Air, where everyone is just giving a big thumbs up, but no one has the courage to say, I disagree, you're wrong, respectfully, present a different alternative. A is for agnostic, and David, I think you're an example of that in your career, right? From law to finance to tech to academia to nonprofit, et cetera. These are for people that are just like they're not wedded to any one device, they're not wedded to any one field or career. They like to play the field and be more decathletes rather than just run one event. M, and this was the toughest one for me to learn, is messianic. My first job over 30 years ago was working for Edgar Bronfman Sr. at the World Jewish Congress. And I had lunch with his right-hand man, Stephen Herberts, one day, and he said, Marco, the truly successful people out there, and when I say success, just to be clear, yes, it's monetary, but it's also impact, it's independence, it's having some fun. Steve said to me, the truly successful people are messianic about their careers. They don't just see it as work or job or even a career. They see it as their divine calling, their purpose on this planet. At the time, it seemed outlandish, but I could only get this book done, my first book at 56 years old, with Hachette, a major publisher, because I was messianic about doing it. First thing I think of when I get up in the morning, last thing I think of when I hit the pillow. I, insecure, that's right. Not about bravado, not about machismo, not about overconfidence. Some of the research that you saw, David, we compare imposters with people who suffer from the Dunning-Kruger effect. That is when incompetent people think they're actually competent. So what we're seeing now in the world of COVID, et cetera, is it's not all good. Just because we're paranoid doesn't mean they're not trying to kill us, as I learned from Rabbi David Rosen in Jerusalem after he was the chief rabbi of Ireland. So there's a lot of, as you indicated, there's some Jewish spirit in there that you're picking up on that most of the interviewers have not. Nuts, that's right, a little bit mashugana, a little bit childlike. Harvard Business School research indicated that young children ask hundreds of questions a day. By the time they are teenagers, it's whittled down to a couple, less than a handful. That's a sad statement. So being a little eccentric, being a little out there, I talk about my own experiences growing up in Venice, California in the 70s. Believe me, there were plenty of people that fit the nuts category. G finally is gallant. That's my favorite. I was inspired by a lot of people, including someone I've never been fortunate to meet, who talks about Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks talks about achrayut, acher, responsibility for the other. And the gallant is someone that puts principles above profit. I have several examples on that front that we can talk about. Together it spells roaming. It's rare that we get checks in all the boxes, but there are some uber primitives that do in fact get those checks. And they, in my view, are worth emulating, assuming they keep it on the rails and don't go off the rails. And there are some cautionary tales in my book of people I've worked with, including WeWork and others that have taken it a little too far.
Great, thank you. And it's interesting that you identified me as an agnostic in your acronym of primitive, because when I first picked up the book, I was thinking, well, okay, you know, I would be a civilized person in my career path, and I'm not primitive, but I'm interested in learning about them. And the more I read the book, I certainly identified in a little bit in several areas, but probably the most of which is the one that you identified as agnostic. And frankly, it's something that you know, thinking about it after reading the book, I also tend to have conversations with when I'm speaking with former students or colleagues in the field that are either thinking about maybe a new opportunity or who have to make a decision about what to do because of something beyond their control in terms of choices. And being curious. You talk about shunning specialization, and adapting to happenstance and embracing uncertainty. And I think those are certainly some of the key elements to a discussion on recalibrating professional success during these uncertain times. And of course, for me, because it's the one I identified more with, it's the one I'm going to gravitate towards the discussion. But I didn't know if there's anything else that you might want to flesh out in terms of the agnostic category that people might take as they're thinking about their careers and their professional path during these unique times.
Well, in my lexicon, agnostic is a 180 from the occupational of homing, where civilized people identify themselves. I am a CPA. I am a plastic surgeon. I am a teacher in the LA Unified School District. Shout out to my Aunt Evelyn, who taught in the LA Unified School District for almost 50 years. She should be watching today from Century City, California. So, so it's the ability to no longer worship domain expertise and instead say, it's about talent, it's about abilities, it's about intellectual curiosity, it's about self-motivation. We are seeing that play out big time during this pandemic, right? We all have friends who are in the travel industry, who work in hotels, airlines. We have other friends who work in restaurants. They've been hit especially hard. So I think it's a lesson here that if you're more of a generalist, despite the fact in a lot of places, I was taught myself, by the way, and I talk about in the book, the first thing I was taught by a mentor was, Marco, you got to specialize. You got to focus. It's all about focus, focus, focus. Well, maybe we have to relearn that and instead have a broader view of how our mindset and how our skills are applicable in today's world. You know, I have a kid who's a frontline worker working at a grocery store. Is it his be all and end all job? No, but it shows that today more than ever, we have to be nimble, flexible, adept. And I think part of that is getting into our primal drive. And just as our ancestors emerged from the cave, there was a lot of uncertainty, but they used that uncertainty to fuel achievement and build in some security that was otherwise lacking.
Great. And then you had talked about kind of the relentless chapter. You kind of compare again relentless primitives versus the more civilized people, and you give an example of the folks that tend to work their way up from perhaps the bottom of an organization all the way to somewhere in the top, getting the proverbial gold watch at their retirement, and never, you say, leaving their lane. But primitives, you say, they shift lanes, and you know, with where the economy has been, you know, in the last, say, decade, and where we are today, and the insecurities that people have. You talk about how important it is for people to be able to change lanes both comfortably and nimbly. And I didn't know if you might want to expound upon that a little bit.
Absolutely. And part of it might sound retro to folks out there. And I start in the book from a very personal place. My grandfather was born in 1891 in San Francisco. He was 21 years older than my grandmother, Edith B. Greenberg, who was a very loyal student at then University of Judaism, now of course AJU. And in his career with his brothers, they literally went from auctioneers to distillers of alcohol during Prohibition, to owning Western costumes, to starting Standard Brands Paint Company that grew to 120 stores around the Western United States, to being the impetus for a nephew getting into Big Five, which is still in Southern California. So I think, you know, that's an example of people that were not trained. My grandfather had an 8th grade education. And I think you're seeing a lot of that today. And I'm the first person to encourage my kids of the value of higher education. but we're also seeing higher education adapt. And who would have thought that my son can major this coming fall in entrepreneurship? So we're seeing a lot of changes in education at AJU. You're at the forefront of that, but part of it comes from embracing the buffet out there and sampling different dishes rather than eating at the same course all the time. I have an example on that, which is Alan Lightman, professor at MIT. He brought the writing requirement to MIT, although he started as a physicist. And he became an author. For those that don't know the name, look at Wikipedia. He wrote Einstein's Dreams on Down. He wrote a memoir of growing up Jewish in Memphis before and after segregation. So I've learned from Alan, who's become a friend, that we can do a lot of things. I've learned certainly from other people along the journey. In Relentless, we talk about a young 29-year-old who I met, who started his business with $80,000 in credit card debt, had a 2.2 grade point average from RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, and it took him 6 years to graduate in bioinformatics. He went on to bootstrap a company. I was with him the day that he sold the company to Robert F. Smith, the richest African-American in this country, for north of $1.5 billion. And I would argue, if someone asked me, what made Austin McCord of Datto, the only unicorn in Connecticut, so successful, I would say it was his ability and his ability to tap his primal drive. And Deb and I were talking about this earlier. That doesn't just mean relentless. It doesn't just mean agnostic. It doesn't just mean insecure of rightfully thinking someone's about to eat your lunch, because it does happen out there a lot, but also gallant. One of the highlights of my own career was flying on a very cold day from LaGuardia to Rochester, New York. It looked like we were coming down into the tundra in the middle of December. And it was the day that Austin, then 32, wrote a check for $50 million donated to RIT. And I had the good fortune of being his only consultant or even employee that was with him that day. And to see that act of supporting the other and genuinely caring about enriching us all and all boats rising was one of the highlights of my professional life. And that's the kind of message in Primitive, tapping the primal drive that powers the world's most successful people. I want to help people tap into that. And
before I enter into any follow-up discussion on that, I just want to invite anyone who's watching that might have questions for Marco or for us to please submit them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And again, for those of you that just might be joining us now, I'm speaking with Marco Greenberg, the author of Primitive, a fantastic book that currently recently was in the Wall Street Journal bestseller business books. And so it's a pleasure to have Marco with us. And Marco, as you were talking about Austin McCord and his story, if you will, and as a I think first you were discussing him as a relentless primitive, and then transitioned to other things, including being gallant with his large gift to his alma mater. But one of the things, going back to the relentless piece that you talk about, is that the relentless primitives, they don't have patience for wasting time, and so they leapfrog ahead rather than you talk about. They don't just try hard, because oftentimes the conventional wisdom is just try hard, try again, keep trying, be relentless in that way. And you say that, well, being relentless is not exactly just keeping at the same old thing, and you might want to discuss that if you don't mind.
Absolutely. There are too many examples to point to, but I in addition to people that I've had the ability and good fortune to work with, in my own reading, and part of being a writer, I think, is also being an avid reader. I came across a story of Jennifer Hyman, who went to Harvard in the business school and started Rent the Runway. And you might remember this anecdote from the book, but it's one of my favorites. They're driving down the West Side Highway for a meeting with Diane von Furstenberg, a meeting that can completely change the trajectory in a positive way of their fledgling startup. And the assistant calls Jennifer, two Jennifers that started the company, calls Jennifer Hyman and says, we're going to have to cancel the meeting. And instinctively, she says, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. We have bad cell phone coverage. I will see you at your office. And she hangs up. Most people would do as they were told, of course. They would say, oh, I'm so sorry. Can we reschedule, etc. So sometimes bending the rules a little bit and not, just following the rule book can be super advantageous. I learned that also in working with some of the biggest players in Startup Nation in Israel. And anyone that's done business in Israel knows that it can be a very inspiring experience. It can also be an exhausting exhausting experience. I'll leave it at that. I'm an Israeli citizen, so please don't have the ADL contact me. I love Israel. But part of it is what a word I learned from my first boss in Israel, PBDO, Moshe Teomim, of foilishtik. It's not lying, but it's not, it's cutting some corners here and there. So but maintaining the ethical grounding. So I think in our own folk tradition, in our religious tradition, I'm not the rabbi here and I'm not the professor, but I think there's so much that we can see in how we look at the world. And one of the things that I tried to do in the book, from different faiths, of course, Christianity, we have an example from our Muslim friends, etc. But I tried to sprinkle in some examples that have really resonated with me over the years and others that I know. And one is, of course, the Sukkah for Sukkot. What a beautiful emblem of embracing our insecurity rather than trying to hide it. We know it's all impermanent. We know it can all be blown away. So I think as a people, we're literally and figuratively roaming. I like to joke that I'm the wandering Jew. I was in Cincinnati this weekend. I take an electric car around the country. Yes, I am an Elon Musk fan. Yes, I do believe in my lexicon, he's an uber primitive, but so are people like Oprah Winfrey, so are people like Ariana Huffington, who I've had an opportunity to work with her and her team. So there are a lot of people that we can pluck, pull, cut and paste from, but at the end of the day, this is about honoring our own spirit and doing what feels right in our body, what feels right in our heart, right in our soul, and right in our head.
And I'm going to take this opportunity to read a question from an audience member, and the member asks, Marco, your ideas are refreshing and progressive. Today, however, one's resume has to get past a recruiter with an open mind who can see your talent, and then that talent can apply to different positions. Any advice with regards to these gatekeepers? I think there's a great...
And these, great question. The gatekeepers are the epitome of civilized behavior. They're grounded, they're measured, they're non-confrontational, they're by the book. We need them, but if we skew too far in that direction, we're gonna be very unhappy. Or we're gonna have a BS job. Listen to Hidden Brain about BS jobs. They had a segment with a professor that wrote a book by that title, BS Jobs. One of the things we have to recognize is that algorithms, machine learning, AI don't hire people, people hire people. So one of the things that I've heard in teaching classes as an adjunct at NYU and Fordham is that kids come to me and say, how can I game the job boards? How can I get around these filters, and how do I really maximize Indeed and LinkedIn, et cetera? Sometimes, guys, you got to go to the top. My wife got a new job at the end of April at the height of COVID, and part of it was not just waiting in line at HR, and no diss to HR, they play an important role, but she went to the head of the organization and got a job as a drug and alcohol counselor, another sadly in-demand field. So think about how you can form those personal connections and have a little chutzpah and do the unexpected so that you get noticed, right? It's not stalking, it's not creepy, it's personal connections. I very rarely have anyone approach me that would be able to flatter me and kill me with kindness in a positive way, just in a simple Google search. Everything's vanilla, everything's boilerplate. we can all be more creative than that. And this is a time that you really have to be more creative, more audacious. We have a section in our book, David, that you saw that a story, an anecdote of someone who gives a pitch for new business at BBDO, a former employer, on his white t-shirt, writes out the entire pitch. Rather than PowerPoints, he writes out the entire pitch, backside, on his t-shirt. So is that audacious? Would that work with an accounting firm? Probably not. But you got to pick your audience, and you got to put the ball up in the air, as we say in football, not just the ground game, meaning take some calculated risks.
Yeah, and I think also to build on that a little bit, from your book, you talk about, well, if we are rejected from something, or if we don't get what we want in a given instance, we can see that, that okay, there's a wall there, and a door. Do we want to keep pounding on that door? Do we want to scale the wall, or do we maybe just want to look for other doors? And
you're so right. And Erica Brown from GW, wonderful Jewish educator I mentioned earlier, she talks about opening that new door, right? How many people do we know that have pounded their head against the wall, even being risk-friendly, risk-taker enough to start their own business, but they don't change directions. They keep at it. And life is a game of adjustments, and you got to make those adjustments to be successful. I must say that I dedicated the book to a good friend who was killed on 9/11. His name is Danny Lewin. He was in the most elite unit in the IDF, Sayeret Matkal, as an American and Israeli, went to the Technion, went to the MIT, started a company with his professor, fought back on 9/11 on Flight 11. The company that he started with his MIT professor is called Akamai Technologies. It's an S&P 500 company. So I dedicated the book to Danny because for Danny never took a business class, ever. He didn't know anything about Wall Street. He didn't know anything. He didn't know what he didn't know. And he had that childlike sense of wonder and possibility that unfortunately is beaten out of us. So I think like anything in life, it's that yin yang, and we want to capture the best of the civilized world, but sometimes that pendulum is swung too far out, and we also want to get back in touch with what really makes us tick, and hopefully the book is a step in that direction.
And I think when you mentioned Danny a number of times throughout the book, but I seem to remember that one place where you discussed him quite a bit was talking about oppositional primitives, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on what is an oppositional primitive, and is that how is that different from just being a contrarian that likes to twist tails and create conflict for the sake of creating conflict?
David, you read the book, and it's a really important distinction. This is not, as we say, just your uncle at Thanksgiving trying to be contrarian for contrarian's sake, and you say tomato and I say tomato. When I worked in the advertising and PR industry for BBDO, we were taught in a brainstorm, and incidentally, the agency BBDO developed the brainstorm. Never say anything negative. Always say it's a great idea. The more ideas, we don't want to shoot anyone down, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out that curtailing our critique actually had negative impact on the actual outcome and on the results. So Danny was someone who could be more rah-rah than anyone. He was effusive. He was the ultimate high-fiver, hugger, clapper, but he also was someone that spoke truth. And if he thought something was off base, he would say it. And unfortunately, today we're in a culture that has become so risk-averse and so afraid of offending. And by the way, there is a good side to that too. There were insensitive things said towards women, minority groups, etc. So what we're talking about is constructive critique in the business community that can sit people down and say, you know what, I totally disagree with that, and let me explain why. Let me talk about another way to do it What do you guys think? Because the current path is not taking us where we want to go. I can't tell you how many conference calls I've been on where people are just shaking, yes, great idea. I just want to echo that remark. That's totally on point. We are so frightened of wrestling. And what does the word Yisrael mean? We wrestle with. One rabbi says this, the other rabbi says that. It's not dogma. We need to reinfuse that into our professional lives to make it more interesting, more vibrant, and at the end of the day, more rewarding.
Absolutely. And I think to build on that a little bit, you also talk about in the chapter about being insecure. I think it was an example of a C-suite executive at YouTube, the EMEA division of YouTube, relative to her bat mitzvah and how that impacted her ultimately seeking feedback and criticism. You might want to.
Absolutely. We're talking about a wonderful woman, one of the most talented people I've had the opportunity to work with. At one point, she worked for me, but even then, I really worked for her. Her name is Ricky Drury, Israeli, who has conquered the world. She works, as you said, first at Google. Now she's running marketing in Europe, in the Middle East, and Africa for YouTube. And one of the things that she says in the book that's so powerful, she says, I'm the most insecure person I know. Here you have an executive who's risen to the absolute top by embracing her insecurity, by weaponizing the anxiety. And part of that, as you said, David, came from a bat mitzvah that never happened because it turned out to be a prank and no one came to her bat mitzvah. And she was heartbroken, understandably, but she's used that fear and uncertainty in a constructive way. It's also helped her become a better manager. Because I think one of the things that there's a disconnect between subordinates and superiors, or whatever you want to call them, is that we've lost that humanity, that we're putting on a mask, literally and figuratively, rather than being real with it. And I think Ricky is a great example of the power of showing vulnerability. Not just talking about vulnerability as a buzzword like transparency and authenticity, but actually doing it, showing it. And that can be very intoxicating, and that can be really, really powerful as a leader who wants to take their organization to the next level, or someone who wants to, start their career. And it's a scary time to start your career. If you're not scared, there's something wrong with you. So, but it's okay, and learn to seize that energy. And in the words of a best-selling book from the 70s, my book, as you can see, is a little self-help, a little business, a little career, a little memoir. But there was a book by the title of Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway by Susan Jeffers. And she passed away only, I think, last year. I ordered the book on Amazon. I'm going to be reading it because I think there's age-old wisdom there. And certainly in our faith and among our people, you can see that, we've been Roman for a long time and earning the dividends from that.
And just to build on your, to segue perhaps on your 1970s reference, also to say that you at one point discussed Supertramp and being sensible, logical, or practical, which might also be another way of looking at someone that is non-primitive. But any of my students over the last 10 or 15 years that have ever had me, I know that I always insert pop music and pop culture references in, although the ones from the 70s are no longer being understood as much by a crop of students.
Present company excluded. You're talking to the right audience.
But the book is Primitive. The author is Marco Greenberg. Thank you, Marco, for joining us. And with that, I will turn it back to Deb.
Thank
you so much, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Marco. Thank you to the AJU for giving us this opportunity. This is, people who've been on these calls with me know that I love to have fun. So that resonated with me too, because I think when you don't have fun, when you do your work or anywhere, you're missing something and it becomes drudgery and you don't enjoy that. So that I really connected with that part and the gallant part. So thank you for that. And let's all have that fun in what we're doing to bring our primitive selves, the best of our primitive selves, in this time of uncertainty, to meet the challenges that are coming. I just love, I love the Jewish thought that comes throughout the book, because you definitely see the Yiddish cup, as you want to say, in whatever different ways that you brought it in. And it was so personal and so vulnerable. And what I also really appreciated is your acknowledgements at the end of the book, because they weren't just, I want to thank, but you gave such specific, heartfelt thank yous. And I really love that. I found that encouraging and inspirational.
That's kind of you. And thanks to Hachette, my publisher, who was terrific to work with, my agent, Michael Palagon. And I think when they saw the length of the acknowledgements, they said, is this part of the book or is this a separate book? It is part of the book, very much so. And the people, both very much alive and those that have passed, are a huge part of my own story. And for those that are recalibrating and are thinking about jumping lanes, I encourage you to do that, and also acknowledge the trepidation that comes along with it. And remember that it's never too early and it's never too late. I'm an example of that, right? I was a consumer of business books my entire life, and I decided to write one finally myself, and I'm really glad I did, and I hope it helps a lot of people.
Well, I'm sure it will, and I hope it will. And people, you could get it on Amazon. So support Marco and his book. And I'd like to, again, thank everyone for being with us. And I'd like to bring your attention to another few wonderful offerings we have this week. This is a great week here at AJU and Biyachad. Tomorrow we have our own president of the university, Jeffrey Herbst. Dr. Jeffrey Herbst will be in conversation with Saeed Kashua, who is, the topic is why a Palestinian writes in Hebrew, which, talk about out of the box, like, wow. And then we have Rabbi Sherry Hirsch, our director of innovation, will be in conversation with Chloe Makani and Danielle Robay in the age of influence, how are leading voices adapting? And again, another really amazing conversation on Thursday with Amit Peled, and he will be talking about his journey with his Jewishness. Amit is a world-class cellist. So I invite you to go to aju.edu biyachad together to join us for any and all of these wonderful opportunities. Again, thank you, Marco. Thank you, David. Thank you, AJU. And we look forward to seeing you all soon on this platform. Stay safe, stay healthy, and ask great questions.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.